In a peaceful rural area of Kentucky, where vast fields and lush green hills rise high, there lived an elderly farmer named Jack Anderson. Although he was 62 years old and his body was no longer as strong as it once was, he still remained connected to the land that his grandfather had built during World War II. This land was not just a place for cultivation, but also held countless memories and stories from three generations of the Anderson family. Over the years, there was one thing that Jack had always preserved, not the rice or soybeans, but the small airport his grandfather had built during the war years. An airport just over 3,000 feet long, made of dirt and gravel, simple yet holding immense value. It was here that civilian planes once landed, and it carried memories closely tied to the past. But now, that airport was just a memory. The planes had not visited for many years. Jack never held a grudge, but he still maintained the airport as an inseparable part of the family. Every early morning, when the sun was just rising, Jack would push the old tractor out to the runway to clean the ground and tidy up the airport, despite the cold winds of winter or the heavy rains. He knew that the airport no longer served its original purpose, but for him it was a heritage that had to be preserved. Each month, letters from the bank arrived, notices demanding debt repayment, and Jack knew that the land was slowly slipping away from his family's hands. Foreclosure threats gradually became a reality, and the Heartland Agricultural Corporation, a giant agricultural conglomerate, was steadily buying up farms in the area. He had seen his old friends, like Miller and Johnson, sell their land and leave, and Jack had also received offers from that large corporation. But there was one thing that made him resolutely refuse. They wanted to tear down the airport to use the land for farming, and Jack could not allow that. Family heritage is worth more than money, he often told his loyal companion, his dog Scout. The dog had been with him through the long years, just as Jack's grandfather had held on to the airport with all his faith in the future, even though there was nothing but an empty plot of land. As the airport gradually faded into obscurity and the buyout offers became more frequent, Jack could only continue holding on to one unwavering belief. Whatever happens will happen, but at least he would not give up. A small airport, a heritage not easily erased by others, Jack felt he could not let his grandfather's airport be forgotten, nor could he allow this land, with all the memories tied to three generations of the family, to be turned into lifeless farmland. One gloomy day, as dark clouds swirled across the sky and the wind began to pick up, Jack Anderson felt an uneasy, vague sense of worry in his heart. The winter storm was on its way, and as usual, Jack began preparing for the upcoming fierce thunderstorm. Although he was used to heavy rains and strong winds, today something felt different. It was an inexplicable feeling, a restlessness in his chest that he had never experienced before. While cleaning the chicken coop, a sudden call came through on the landline, interrupting Jack's thoughts. People rarely called this number anymore, especially since no one was in contact with him through the landline. His anxiety intensified as he picked up the phone. "Hello, Mr. Anderson, this is Colonel Richard Mills from the Air Force," the voice on the other end said, with an authoritative and serious tone. "Do you maintain a private airport on your land?" Jack was momentarily surprised, but still answered, "Yes, that's correct. I've maintained it since 1943. "Good," Colonel Mills continued. "We have an emergency situation. A C-17 from the Air Force needs to make an emergency landing. All other airports are down due to the weather. We need your airport to assist." Jack stood frozen. "C-17?" he repeated, incredulous. "That's a military aircraft, far too large to land on my airport. It needs at least twice the length and solid ground, not dirt and gravel." "I understand your concern," Colonel Mills said, "but our pilot, Ethan Collins, has requested to land here. He knows about your airport and believes it is the best option in this situation." Jack's heart raced. Ethan Collins. The name took him by surprise. His former student, the one he had taught to fly when he was a teenager, was now a pilot in the Air Force. "I can't allow an aircraft like that to land on my airport," Jack said, his voice filled with worry. But he knew this situation was different. If he didn't help, people in need would lose their lives. "We need your help, Jack," Colonel Mills pressed. "If you can prepare the airport, we'll handle the rest." Jack Anderson hung up the phone, a heavy feeling weighing on his heart. Colonel Mills's request echoed in his mind like an impossibility. A C-17, a massive aircraft, impossible to land at a small airport like his. His airport was only a 3,200-foot strip of land, far from enough to accommodate such a giant military plane, especially with the storm closing in, the winds picking up, and the rain beginning to pour down. "It can be," Jack muttered to himself. "How could I let such a plane land here?" He couldn't believe it. In his entire life, he had witnessed many planes land, but never a C-17, and certainly not under these conditions. But then another name came to his mind: Ethan Collins. It was Ethan, the boy he had taught to fly all those years ago, the one he had always felt so proud of. Ethan, a skilled pilot, was now a member of the US Air Force. That sudden burst of pride filled Jack's chest. Ethan, his former student, was now the one he trusted most, and he was asking to land at this airport. Ethan trusted him, and that made it impossible for Jack to say no. "I know him," Jack whispered as if to reassure himself. "If he believes it can be done, then I have to help." The storm grew stronger and the rain came down harder. Jack rushed outside, anxiety building within him. He pulled his old truck out of the barn and drove it to the airport. In the dim light of his truck, he began setting up emergency lights. The LED lights he had prepared long ago, though they had never been used. The ground was soaked, but he persevered, installing each light one by one, marking the path for the C-17. Meanwhile, Colonel Mills continued to communicate through the radio, his voice distorted by the wind and rain. "Jack, our pilot, Ethan Collins, will try to land at your airport. Don't worry, we'll do everything we can to ensure safety." Jack heard Ethan's voice on the radio, deep and calm. "Thank you, Jack. I'll be there shortly." Jack's heart raced. Ethan's voice sounded familiar, and even though he was anxious, there was an invisible trust that began to spread. Ethan had flown on this very airport when he was a boy. He knew it. He trusted it. That was something Jack could not overlook. The plane hadn't arrived yet, but the howling wind and rain made the atmosphere feel heavy. Every minute felt like a century. Jack looked back at the airport, a place he had spent decades preserving. Despite the challenges, despite the risks, Jack could not let the family legacy be erased. It was a part of his life, and now it was a part of Ethan's life too. A minute later, the C-17 finally appeared. The roaring engines echoed across the darkened sky. Jack held his breath, watching the enormous plane descend at a speed he couldn't have imagined. "He's too fast," Jack whispered, his heart nearly stopping. "He won't stop in time." The plane plunged down, its massive body appearing through the rain, the lights from the airport beacons reflecting off its fuselage. The C-17 was coming in too fast, and Jack felt like it wouldn't stop before hitting the edge of the airport. The end of the runway was near, and beyond it was a ditch, and the soybean plants growing. Every meter of land seemed to stretch on forever. But then a miracle happened. The C-17 landed and began slowing down in a way that seemed almost magical. The plane, so heavy but under Ethan's control, came to a stop just before reaching the runway's edge. "He did it," Jack sighed with relief, exhausted but filled with pride. Ethan did it. As soon as the plane came to a stop, the radio crackled again. "Thanks for the support, Jack. We've landed safely." Jack stood there, the rain still falling, but his heart felt lighter than ever. The storm was passing, and one thing was undeniable. Ethan had done what no one thought possible. The storm had calmed, but strong gusts of wind continued to howl through the airport, driving raindrops into the wet ground. Jack Anderson stood there, his eyes fixed on the C-17 sliding across his runway. His heart raced, each breath felt like a loud sound in the quiet air. The C-17 kept speeding down the runway, the massive plane like a giant metal beast charging through the beacons Jack had carefully placed along the runway. He saw the plane's front wheels touch the ground for the first time, but the feeling of unease didn't leave him. The plane was heavy, the runway was short, and the wind was still fierce. The rumbling sounds echoed as the C-17 continued to race across the ground. He won't stop in time, Jack thought to himself, his eyes squinting as the plane continued to slide, nearly pushing the limits of the runway. If he doesn't stop soon, it'll crash into my field. Jack couldn't take his eyes off the scene unfolding before him. The plane was getting closer to the edge of the runway. The wet and muddy ground couldn't provide the solid cushion that concrete would. Everything seemed to slow down in Jack's eyes. Each second felt like a century. But then something unimaginable happened. The C-17, with its enormous size, began to slow down miraculously. The giant wheels of the plane continued to squeeze every ounce of speed from the short runway, but it was Ethan Collins's calmness and skill that made the impossible possible. He did it, Jack whispered, his mouth dry from the overwhelming emotion. The plane kept sliding, but miraculously it stopped just in time, only a few meters from the edge of the runway. Jack breathed a sigh of relief, feeling like a heavy weight had lifted from his chest. In that moment, he couldn't believe his eyes. It felt like a miracle. The plane had stopped safely and there were no injuries. Ethan had done what even the most experienced pilots wouldn't dare attempt. Incredible, Jack thought to himself. He couldn't believe that such a heavy and enormous plane could land successfully on a dirt runway like his. Suddenly, the radio crackled, and Ethan's familiar voice came through the speaker. "Thank you, Jack. We've landed safely." Jack couldn't hide his smile. "We're still alive. He did it," he whispered, his eyes still locked on the plane standing strong on the runway. A sense of pride, trust in Ethan, and the perseverance he had shown welled up inside him. As the plane finally came to a stop, Jack quietly approached. The storm had passed, the sky was slowly brightening, and the dark night was giving way to the first light of dawn. Jack drove his old truck closer to the plane, and through the truck's window he saw Ethan step out of the cockpit, tired but still carrying a resilient air about him. When Ethan stepped down, Jack's heart skipped a beat. The young man had returned, not just as an old friend, but as a hero. Memories flooded Jack's mind, remembering when Ethan was just a boy, standing and watching the planes at his airport, dreaming of one day becoming a pilot. "Ethan," Jack called out, the roar of the plane still echoing behind him. "You did it. That was amazing." Ethan turned around, flashing a wide smile. "Thank you, Jack. Without you, I wouldn't have made it." He stepped forward and embraced Jack like a brother. "Thank you, Ethan," Jack replied, his emotions breaking through. "You've always been a great pilot. I've known that for a long time." As the two old friends talked, the U.S. Air Force team began to take the next steps, dismantling equipment, preparing for the emergency medical supplies that the C-17 had brought. The storm had passed, but what they had accomplished would be a story that Jack would tell forever about resilience, trust, and steadfast friendship between two generations. But for Jack, what mattered more than anything was the family legacy he still protected, this small airport, now a crucial part of the country's emergency rescue system. His decisions and his trust had not only saved the land, but had given new purpose to the legacy he was safeguarding. When the C-17 landed safely and the massive aircraft came to a stop, the atmosphere became strangely quiet, only the sound of the wind blowing through the fields and the raindrops pattering on the wet ground. Jack Anderson stood for a long while, his eyes fixed on the plane that he never imagined could land successfully on this land. He saw Ethan Collins, his former student, step out of the cockpit looking tired but steadfast. As Ethan stepped out, Jack couldn't help but notice a grown man, no longer the boy who once stood under the shadow of small civilian planes, watching in awe at the pilots. Now, Ethan was an Air Force pilot, and landing the C-17 on a small dirt runway like Jack's was no easy task, but Ethan had done it. "Ethan, you did it," Jack said, his voice choked with emotion. "You did what no one thought was possible." Ethan flashed a broad smile and walked over, patting Jack on the back in a familiar way. "Thank you, Jack," he said, his voice low but full of gratitude. "Without you, I wouldn't have been able to do it." Jack looked into his eyes, unable to hold back the emotion. This was a moment he could never forget. "You've been a great pilot ever since you were a kid," Jack said, his eyes never leaving Ethan. "I've always believed in you." The two stood there for a moment in silence. The world around them seemed to stop. The storm had passed, and in the dim light of the early morning, Jack and Ethan realized that, despite how long it had been since they last met, they still shared an unbreakable bond. They were teacher and student, they were friends, and most importantly, they both understood that there are values in life that cannot be measured by money or technological advancement, but by trust, friendship, and responsibility. After a few minutes, Ethan looked toward the C-17, still parked, then turned back to Jack. "Look, your airport is still intact, and you've done something incredible. We'll need to fix a few things, but everything will be fine." Jack simply smiled. "Thanks, Ethan. I did this for you and for everyone who might need this airport. It's not just a patch of land with a few soybean plants. It's my family's legacy." Jack's words surprised Ethan. He looked at him, and perhaps in that moment he understood that it wasn't just about the planes and the runway, but a long story of a family that had preserved values over many generations. Ethan lifted his gaze to the sky, which was brightening, and felt his heart warm. "Your grandfather would be so proud." Jack smiled, following Ethan's gaze. "What do you think?" Jack asked, his voice softening. "What would you say to your mother if she were still here?" Ethan looked at the plane, his expression softening. "I'd say I kept my promise, and I'd say, I always remember what you taught me, never give up." Jack felt a wave of emotion swell inside him. "The promise," he whispered. "That's all." In that moment, the cold morning winds no longer made Jack feel chilly. On the contrary, he felt like the hardships of the past were gradually fading and a new future was beginning to unfold. His airport was no longer just a patch of land, it was the trust, hope, and resilience of his family, of people like Ethan, whom he had taught and helped. The two stood there watching the C-17, and in the light of a new day, they realized that no matter what the future held, enduring values like tradition, loyalty, and friendship would remain the guiding light for them in life. After the emergency event, when the C-17 had landed safely thanks to the help of Jack and Ethan, a new dawn began to break over Anderson Farm. The storm had passed, but the events of the night still lingered in Jack's mind. However, a sense of relief and pride slowly spread through him. He had done what many thought was impossible, and the family airport still stood as a testament to persistence and loyalty. A few hours later, as the sun began to rise higher, a military vehicle pulled up in front of Jack's house. A man in uniform stepped out, his face serious but full of respect. Jack recognized him immediately, General William Roberts from the U.S. Air Force. He was the one who had led the operation the previous night, the one Ethan had mentioned. General Roberts walked over to Jack and shook his hand firmly. "Jack Anderson," he began, his voice deep but steady. "First, I want to thank you. What you did saved many lives." Jack nodded lightly, feeling a bit embarrassed. "Just did what I could," he replied, his eyes still fixed on the C-17 sitting on the runway. General Roberts observed the airport for a moment, then turned back to Jack. "You know, Jack," he said, his voice softening, "your airport isn't just a family memorial, it proved to be of tremendous value during the recent emergency. And I believe, if you agree, we can use it as an official Air Force facility." Jack was stunned, his eyes widening. "What?" he asked, unable to believe his ears. "This airport? Become an official facility?" General Roberts smiled. "Yes, your airport is strategically located, and it has proven to be strong enough to support military operations. We want to work with you to improve and maintain it as an official emergency facility. Not only that, but this would also protect your land from being bought by a corporation." Jack paused for a moment, feeling like something he had hoped for so long had finally arrived. This was an opportunity for the family airport to not only preserve its historical value, but also grow and serve the community and the country. "So, what are you saying?" Jack asked, his eyes now shining. "I get to keep this land?" "Yes, we'll commit to maintaining your airport, making it a facility for military emergency operations. In the meantime, you'll remain the landowner. We just need the right to use the airport," General Roberts emphasized. Jack felt a wave of emotion rise within him. This not only helped him protect the family land, but it also ensured that the airport would be preserved for future generations, not torn down like so many other structures. "Well then, where do we start?" Jack asked, his voice full of determination. "We'll assist in upgrading the ground, installing beacon systems, and modernizing maintenance equipment. All you need to do is agree, and we'll handle the rest." Jack looked toward the airport, where the beacons were still shining. While not grand or impressive, it held immense value. "I agree," Jack said, his voice firm and full of belief. "Let's begin." The next day, engineers and workers from the U.S. Air Force began upgrading the airport. They leveled the ground, improved the runway, and installed modern equipment to ensure safety for all operations. Throughout the process, Jack kept a watchful eye, feeling a deep sense of pride. The feeling of protecting his family's legacy and contributing to the country made him feel like part of something much greater. With the help of the U.S. Air Force, Jack Anderson not only preserved his family's airport, but also opened up a new opportunity for the land he had protected for so many years. Now, his airport was no longer just a memory, it was an essential facility in the country's emergency system. 3 months after the successful landing of the C-17, the Anderson Auxiliary Landing Facility was officially put into operation. Jack Anderson's airport, which had once been a small, unnoticed runway, had now become a vital emergency facility for the military. Workers from the U.S. Air Force had worked tirelessly to upgrade and maintain the airport, from leveling the ground and installing modern beacon systems to setting up essential equipment to support military emergency operations. Jack sat in the old chair in the family living room, gazing out the window where military planes regularly took off and landed, filling him with overwhelming pride. The storm had passed, and the land he had protected for so many years now had a new purpose. It was no longer just a place to live, but an important part of the nation's emergency rescue system. One spring morning, Ethan returned to visit Jack, this time not due to an emergency, but to share joy and gratitude. He stood at Jack's door, holding a small pin. It was an official recognition pin from the U.S. Air Force, certifying that the Anderson Auxiliary Landing Facility had become an official part of the National Emergency Network. "Jack, I think you'll want this," Ethan said, handing the pin to him. "This facility is no longer just yours, it's ours." Jack looked at the pin, his eyes lighting up, then turned to look at the airport outside. "I can't believe it," he said, his voice choking. "My airport has become part of something much greater. You know, it feels like my grandfather is here with me." Ethan smiled, his eyes also filled with emotion. He would be so proud. At that moment, another C-17 flew by, and Ethan couldn't help but watch it. That's one of the first C-17s we have. We'll always remember this place, Jack, and we'll remember you, the one who preserved the family legacy and worked a miracle in a time of emergency." Jack nodded, proud, but also feeling like a part of him had changed. "I didn't do this just for me," he said, his voice low but full of determination. "I did it for my grandfather and for all those who will have a chance to be saved thanks to this airport. That means more than anything." A while later, during a simple yet formal ceremony, General William Roberts and military leaders visited the airport. General Roberts stood before Jack, his face serious but full of respect. "Jack Anderson," he began, "on behalf of the U.S. Air Force and all those saved by your help, we sincerely thank you. This airport will forever carry the name Anderson, a symbol of perseverance, trust, and sacrifice." Jack stood there, proud but deeply moved. "Thank you, but you're the ones who deserve the thanks. I'm just the keeper of this legacy." As the sign reading Anderson Auxiliary Landing Facility was hung and everyone applauded, Jack felt a wave of pride rise in his heart. Everything had changed. His family's land was no longer just a piece of land in hardship. It had become an important part of the nation, a place where lives could be saved in an emergency. Ethan approached, patted Jack on the back, his eyes full of respect and friendship. "You did the impossible. I always believed in you, Jack." "You did it, Ethan," Jack replied, smiling faintly. "We did it, and my grandfather would be so proud." The two stood there, looking toward the airport, where planes continued to land and take off. It was a beautiful end to a long story of perseverance, loyalty, and friendship. Jack felt at peace knowing he had preserved the family legacy not just for himself, but for future generations.